And now it has a title which requires an explanation. Why all of a sudden is he given a title when he didn't have a title last week? Maybe he complained last week that we didn't give him a title and it changed. I don't think that's the answer. But so some commentators say this is not the same Shimon. This is his Shimon ben Gamliel's, the first one's grandson, who was also, because the name stayed in the family. Rabbi Hillel's son was Shimon, his son was Gamliel, his son was Shimon, his son was Gamliel, his son was Shimon. And then the chain broke. His son was Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, who had two sons, and guess what their names were? Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Gamliel. Okay, and then the name stayed in the family for a few more generations. At any rate, some say this is the second Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, and that explains why his title is given, whereas it wasn't given for his grandfather. Other commentators say, no, it's the same Shimon, but we're talking about two different stages in his life. But he's not given a title. If you remember last week I explained, based on what commentators say, that it was because it was said when he was very young, before he received ordination, before he was given the title rabbi. At least it happened before he actually assumed the position of the leader, of the Nasi, of the head of the Sanhedrin. So he didn't have, and what was his teaching? His teaching was about, when I grew up amongst the sages and I didn't find anything better for the person, better than silence. He's talking, it's like a student. He's talking the importance of silence. When you want to receive something, you have to be able to open your mind. So it's this, even if he said this when he was older, it would still be said as a student who's receiving knowledge and telling you what's the best way to receive knowledge. Yes?
Did you tell us in a previous class or two that there's really no ordination of a rabbi? It has to become...
Oh, and this time there was ordination. Yes, it's still, oh yes.
That would give credence to
it still exists.
Grandson.
No, the ordination stopped centuries after this. Yes, the ordination stopped about the 6th century of the Common Era. Yes?
Why is they don't use numbers?
Numbers?
Yes.
What should they say?
King, she was...
Rabbi Shimon the first, Rabbi Shimon the... That's a good point, but...
Because you're not supposed to name anyone after anyone, so everyone's unique and distinct. So if you say...
No, you could name, they were named, obviously, second Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel was named after his grandfather.
Right, but his grandfather died early. You said the first...
His great-grandfather died early.
Okay. Yeah, but I thought it's really...
His great... Wait, no, 1 second. The second Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel's grandfather was Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, whose grandfather was Rabbi Shimon. So it goes back many more generations. Okay, the theory of relativity gets complicated. So if it's the same Shimon, the explanation for the change is that first he's talking as a student, as someone who is looking up to the earlier generation. I grew up amongst the sages. He's talking about the past. And the second Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, if it's the same one, is when he's already the leader, the head of the Sanhedrin, and he's teaching as a leader. And you'll see in his teaching that it reflects a teaching that of someone who's in a leadership. If you take the other interpretation, which is the majority of commentators, that it's a different Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, there's no question. It's a different, therefore, the other one didn't have the title for whatever reason, and this one did have the title. We're not going to decide which one it was because it has no practical difference. So what did this Rabbi Shimon, and by the way, the second Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel lived after the destruction of the temple, as opposed to the first one. The second one lived after the destruction of the temple, and after the story with Bar Kokhba, who started a rebellion against the Romans, and it ended in disaster with a massacre of the city of Beitar, and the Romans clamped down much more forcefully, banning the study of Torah. And this Rabbi Shimon Gamliel had to hide for a while because he was being sought by the Romans. So he had a little lull in his leadership. The second Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. So what does he say? He used to say, on three things does the world stand: on justice, on truth, and on peace. And he quotes a verse in the Torah, in the book of Zechariah, as it is stated, execute the judgment of truth and peace in your gates. Gates is another way of saying cities, in your cities, because cities of them were surrounded with walls and had gates. So we see from here that you need those three, judgment, justice, truth, and peace. Okay, so the first question is over here. If you remember, at the very beginning of Ethics of the Fathers, in the second Mishna, it quoted another Shimon HaTzaddik, Shimon the righteous, who lived a few centuries before this one, at least 4 centuries before, who was the last member of the men of the Great Assembly. And what did he say? The world stands on 3 things: on Torah, on avoda, service, and on acts of kindness. So what's the difference between those 3 things and these 3 things? How do we reconcile these 2 statements by rabbis who happen to have the same name, Shimon, but I don't know if that has anything to do with it, but they seem to have different formulas for what the world stands on. So there are several explanations. I'll share with you 3 or 4 explanations. Some of them are pretty similar. Rabbi Yonah was the great sage who lived in the 13th century, known for his teachings of morality. So he says that the difference is as follows. When the Mishnah said earlier, the world stands on 3 things: Torah, service, and acts of kindness, it means the world was created for that purpose, that people will study Torah and people will serve Hashem, serve God with prayer, sacrifices, and then prayer, and perform acts of kindness. That's the reason for the world's creation. That's why God created the world. When someone creates something, when someone builds something, if they're intelligent, you expect them to have a reason why they built something. You see someone building a house, you say, well, why did you build this house? Well, so people could live in it. Well, if God created the world, what was his purpose? What did he want from this world? And the answer is he wanted us to study Torah, he wanted us to pray, he wanted us to do acts of kindness. That's how that mission is understood. Here we're talking about, now that the world is created, what keeps the world from disintegrating? What keeps the world from falling apart? And the answer is justice, truth, and peace. Those are the 3 ingredients that preserves the existence of the world.
What is it when he says to execute the judgment of truth? How is that interpreted, to execute the judgment of truth?
To make sure that your judgment is based on truth, not falsehood. You have judges who will take bribes so that their decisions are false, or judges who don't investigate properly and they just take the word of the people who come to court without really inquiring more deeply about it. That's not truth. That's.
So what period in history was correct judgment?
What period of history was good judgment?
Yeah, justice.
Throughout history. Throughout history, you always had places where it was true justice, and there were places where there was a perversion of justice, and those places fell apart. When a system of government is not based on justice, it collapses. Look what happened with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is a system that's based on injustice, where they would torture people to extract confessions from them. Just one example of that. And people who thought that the Soviet Union could never fall apart because it was so powerful, and it fell apart. It just crumbled. So you see that a system that's based on injustice doesn't last. That confirms what it says over here.
What country now has good justice?
No country has perfect justice. You're right, but there are places where the judges are honest and they give out justice. If you're talking about the whole country is imperfect, but we're living in a time that is much more perfect than what we had in the past. much better.
They call it the rule of law. It's honoring the rule of law.
Right, we have a much more just society than you had 100 years ago. And this is true all over the world. So things are getting better. We like to complain about the bad things because those are the things that we capture our attention, but the things that go smoothly, we take for granted. There's another difference based on what we just said, between the first Mishnah that talks about the three things, Torah, service, and acts of kindness, and this Mishnah which talks about justice, truth, and peace. When it comes to justice, truth, and peace, that's universal. That's not just for the Jewish people. The world doesn't just stand and exist because the Jewish people are just and they follow truth and they talk about peace. This is the rest of society. All of humanity needs these three things. When you hear people talking in the Jewish community about tikkun olam, as I mentioned many times, it's a misstatement. Tikkun olam does not mean doing things that make the world a more civilized place. If that's tikkun olam, why is it a Jewish ideal? That's a universal ideal. When God gave Noah, after the flood, 7 commandments, the 7 Noahide commandments, underlying all those commandments was the idea of making sure the world remains a civilized world with justice, truth, and peace. That's what the commandments, let's say, not to murder, not to commit theft. Because if you commit murder and theft, there's no justice and there's no peace. There is anarchy and destruction. And what happened with the flood that destroyed the world? Why did it destroy the world? Because people were not behaving in a civilized manner. It's not reserved for the Jewish people. I think it's insulting to society when Jews say Judaism is about tikkun olam. No, that's the universal. That's not specifically for the Jewish people. That's for everyone. And a Jew has a responsibility to do it, obviously, because he's part of society, but that's not a particularly Jewish focus. The Jewish focus is the first statement of Shimon HaTzaddik, Torah, avoda, and acts of kindness. That is particularly and parochially Jewish, because the non-Jews of the world were not required to study Torah. They're not required to pray. They're not required to do acts of kindness. It's a desirable thing. You want people to do acts of kindness, but it's not the basis. It's not one of their 7 Noahide commandments. The 7 Noahide commandments are not to be blasphemous towards God. First of all, not to believe in other gods, not to be blasphemous towards God, not to steal, not to commit murder, not to commit sexual crimes, not to eat an animal without first killing it, not to be cruel to animals, in other words, and to establish a judiciary that will enforce laws and legislate laws that protect society. Those are the 3 things of justice, truth, and peace. Because without those 7, you're not going to have justice, you're not going to have peace, and it's not true. But Torah and avoda and gemilas chasadim, those 3 things that the first Shimon said, that is reserved for the Jewish people. The Jewish person can't say, I'm going to be civilized, but I'm not going to go out and help other people and give charity to other people. No, that is something the Jews are obligated to do. It's not an option. It's not that if you feel like you want to be kind today, you'll be kind. It's mandated. Another little bit of an alternative, a variation of what we just said, given by one of the early commentators, 13th century. The difference between those 3 and these 3 is the first 3, well, let's start with the second 3 that we just learned today. The object is to keep the world from disintegrating. The first 3, Torah, service, and acts of kindness, is to give meaning to the world. You can have a world that exists. It doesn't fall apart. It's not chaotic. It's not anarchy. But it has no purpose. People, and this is in an individual's life, people could be civilized people, and you can't fault them for anything they did wrong. They didn't do anything wrong. But they have no purpose in life. They have no reason why they're here. They don't have a higher purpose. If someone says, I'm just going to behave, I'm not going to get into trouble, I won't be arrested because I didn't violate any laws, but you have no higher purpose in life, then your life has no meaning. And what gives purpose in life? Torah, prayer, and acts of kindness. That gives your life a purpose. It doesn't just justify your existence, that you're not going to destroy your existence, but it gives meaning to your existence. Another approach that the Rebbe uses is that if you look at the difference between the terminology, right over here it says that the world's three things does the world stand. It doesn't say that. I don't always try to find fault with their translation, but it just glares at me sometimes. It doesn't say the three things that was the world stand. It says in Hebrew, ha'olam kayam. Those who know Hebrew will know that kayam does not mean stand. What does it mean? Exists. In the first three, it does say the world stands on three things. There's a difference between saying something stands or something exists. Now, if you wouldn't be totally wrong if you translated exist as standing and standing as existing, but when you separate and you distinguish between one and the other, there must be a difference. The difference is existing means literally existing. If people would not have justice, if people could just go around killing, stealing and destroying everyone else, the world would just fall apart, would just disintegrate.
A much better word than stand would be foundations.
So the world exists. It doesn't say the Hebrew exists.
Embedded in a foundation is
but there's a simple translation. Kayam literally means existing. The world exists when you have justice, truth, and peace. But you can have justice, truth, and peace, and the world will not stand. The world will wobble. What does that mean, the world will wobble? Without Torah, we don't have direction. And when you don't have direction, what happens? You waver. Even within the realm of goodness, there are a lot of good things I can do. I could, just to use a few common examples, I could help someone in a hospital. That's a good thing. I could go to work and support my family. And I could go around feeding the homeless. They're all good things. But which should I do? And a person will be, I'm just giving an example of positive things, where you could waver. And one day you go in one direction, and one day you say, no, I will do this. And you have no direction in life. And the same thing is true in every area of life. It doesn't have to be good versus evil. It could be good versus good. But if you don't have any direction in life, you could spend your life doing good things and not accomplishing anything. Let's say a person who's endowed with a certain gift, a certain talent, with which they can do good, and they ignore their talent and they do something else, and they're not good at what the other thing that they do. They're not standing. They're wavering. They're going away from where they should be standing to another place. And then they realize, what I did is wrong, I'll try something else. And there are people we call them lost souls. There's a famous parable, analogy of two people, a rich man and a poor man. And the poor man was strong and able-bodied, and he could have helped someone whose wagon got caught in the mud and couldn't be dragged out of it. And who tries to schlep him out? A rich man who didn't know how, he never handled such things, and he got all soiled and beaten up by the horses, and he goes to the hotel that he was staying at, and the whole Shabbos he's laying in bed because he was knocked out. Meanwhile, all the poor people who were accustomed to have him invite them to the meal got invited by the poor man who should have been the one to take the guy out of the mud, but instead he is inviting all the other poor people to his house, and he can't afford to give them anything. So these are called the lost souls. The person who should be schlepping was inviting guests. The person who should be inviting guests was schlepping. and those souls have to come back down again in another incarnation because they misdirected their life. How do you know where to go? How do you know direction? How do you know when to turn right, when to turn left? You have a GPS. The GPS is the godly positioning system. And where does God give us the positioning? In the Torah. So that Mishna is not talking about what the world exists on, without which the world would just fall apart, but it's what makes the world stand and be stable, where you know exactly what your purpose is, where you should go, when you should go. The Torah guides us, tells us what we should do in every day of the week, what we should do on Shabbat, what we do on a holiday, what we do at certain times, what we should not do at certain times, and we have stability in our lives. There's another distinction between the first Mishnah and the second one that some commentaries say. There it was talking about in the days of the Beis HaMikdash, the Holy Temple. When we had the Holy Temple, we had the ability to study Torah undeterred, wasn't disturbed by other considerations. We had peace. We were stable. We were able to serve God through the sacrifices, which was the primary way of service in those days. And we had the ability, we had the wealth, we had the ability to do acts of kindness. But when the temple was destroyed, what keeps us going? What keeps us going is that we have at least justice, we have truth, and have peace. So the first Mishnah is talking about in the days of the temple. The second Mishnah is talking about in the days of exile, when we don't have the luxuries that we can study Torah the way we used to. We don't have the luxuries of bringing sacrifices. We may not have the luxuries of acts of kindness, although that we still preserve more than anything else. But and all the other things have been compromised. This interpretation was given by a very famous rabbi, with which he explained a puzzling Midrash. This rabbi was Rabbi Jonathan Eybeschutz. Rabbi Jonathan Eybeschutz lived in the 17th, 18th century. He probably was born around the late 17th century, and he passed away about 1760, 1770, something like that. He was very controversial. He was accused of being a follower of Shabbatai Tzvi, and the whole Jewish world was split in two camps because he was in a major controversy between himself and Rabbi Yaakov Emden. These were two titans. These were the two most prominent Talmudic scholars in the world. And to this day, they're both respected. And Rabbi Jonathan was ultimately vindicated by most authorities. At any rate, that's not important for what I'm going to say in his name. So, in one of his books, he has a puzzling Midrash. And he answered that Midrash, explained it with what we just said, the difference between the days of the temple and the subsequent to the days since the destruction of the temple. There's a genre of Midrash. Midrash are a collection of rabbinic teachings on the Torah that are not legal. Most of them don't focus on the legal aspects of Torah. They focus on the more, what they call homiletical, the agadic. And there's another body of Midrash called Midrash Paliya, puzzling Midrash. Midrash that doesn't make any sense. It's like riddles. They were designed as riddles to get us to be creative and think. This is the Midrash. The angels asked God, "On what does the world stand?" And God said, the world should sprout vegetation. That's words in Genesis. Tadshe haaretz Desha. The earth shall sprout vegetation. And they didn't know what he said. We also don't know. The angels didn't know. We certainly don't know. So God said, "Don't you know that the temple will be destroyed?" Does that make any sense? If you think it makes sense, there's something wrong with you.
I mean, why would...
So let me repeat it again. The angels asked God, "And what does the world stand?" And God said, "May the earth bring forth Desha, vegetation." And they didn't know what he said, what he meant by that. So God says, "Don't you know that the temple will be destroyed?" Okay, so
My interpretation is that it was, that it's the inevitability of the Beit HaMikdash, that although it will be destroyed, that it is inevitable and eternal that it will last, that the third one will last forever.
So what does it have to do with the earth giving forth vegetation?
Because once the temple is destroyed, vegetation will take its place until it's returned.
Vegetation doesn't take the place of the temple.
Sure, it grows over, I don't think so. Once it's destroyed, the earth regenerates, it grows things, it will grow over the temple and the remains, and then once things are fulfilled...
But aren't there more clear references to things lasting?
Grass grows.
Not on rock.
Yeah.
That is when the world is
3 times,
destroyed,
next.
start from the beginning. Start growing vegetation.
So what does that mean the world stands on this? What is the question was originally, on what does the world stand? And God says, let the earth produce vegetation. That the temple thing comes later. And then they said, what are you talking about? He says, don't you know the temple will be destroyed? Well, this is the way Rabbi Jonathan Eybeschutz gives the answer. He says, there are 2 Mishnas over here. The Mishnah we just learned is that the world stands on 3 things, on justice, truth, and peace. And the first Mishnah, or the beginning of the Ethics of the Fathers, it says the world stands on 3 things, which are 3 different things. So how do you reconcile that? So the answer is, when he says the world stands on 3 things, Torah, service, and acts of kindness, the difference is that when Shimon HaTzaddik, the first Shimon, was talking about in the days when the temple stood, he lived in the days of the beginning of the second temple. So he was talking in the days of the Beis HaMikdash. The second Rabbi Shimon, the one we just studied, is after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. That even if we don't have the service of the Beis HaMikdash, and we can't study Torah the same way and do acts of kindness the same way because of being in exile, but the world will still exist because we have these other 3 things, justice, truth, and peace. Now we understand the Midrash. The angels asked God, on what does the world stand? And God said, Desha. Desha I translate as vegetation, but Desha is an acronym. Din-Shalom-Emet. Justice, truth, and peace. The word Desha, which means vegetation, actually is a hint to those 3 things. So that's what the angels asked. And what does the world stand? And God said, on Desha, on vegetation. Vegetation is a metaphor for justice, truth, and peace. But they didn't understand. Why didn't they understand? Because they already knew the other Mishnah, that the world stands on Torah, service, and acts of kindness. So they were confused, the angels. Just like we may have been confused by that. And God says, don't you know the temple will be destroyed? And since the temple will be destroyed, we can't just rely on Torah, service, and acts of kindness. We now need Desha. We now need justice, truth, and peace. Very ingenious way of answering it. So when you say the word Desha, vegetation, it's an acronym for the 3 things upon which the world exists. Justice, truth, and peace.
How do we explain that the world still exists when there's never been peace?
If there wouldn't be peace, we wouldn't be here. Are we in a war now? Everyone is in a war? There's peace, there's not universal peace. That we have to wait for Mashiach. That'll never happen without Mashiach. Someone once suggested to a Hasidic rabbi, why can't we get all the rabbis together in one room and let's solve all the problems? So that rabbi says, you want World War III? Then they came to the Rebbe, our Rebbe, and they asked him the same question. He says, you want Mashiach? That's never going to happen without Mashiach, that everyone is going to get together in one room and be total peace. But there's this total peace, universal peace, and there's partial peace. At least there's much less destruction in the world than there was in this 20th century.
But also, these things already exist. It's up to each one of us to cultivate it, to bring it, to spread it.
If there would be no...
It's already here, but we have to cultivate it, earn it, spread it, understand it.
Right, but if we wouldn't have peace, we wouldn't exist. If the Soviet Union decided to launch one of the nuclear weapons, we would have total destruction of the world. And to the extent that peace increases, then the stability of the world increases. It's all measured based on how much peace we have, how much truth, and how much justice. Now, these sound like three different things: justice, truth, and peace. But the verse that is brought over here has all three connected. So some commentaries say, yes, they're connected. The first thing you need is to have justice. You have to have laws. You can't have an anarchy. But if you don't have truth, the justice will collapse. If you have a judge who's not honest, and he's going to distort and pervert justice, it's because he's not truthful. He's dishonest. And without peace, justice and truth will not help. If you don't have peace, the fact that you have justice and you have truth, but if you have no peace, that won't help you. You need all three. Each one reinforces the other. One commentary say that justice refers to action. The judges tell you what's legal or what's illegal in terms of your behavior. They don't really tell you what to say. There's no prohibition in America against lying. Yeah, if you do lie in court, that's perjury. But if you just lie, as we know politicians like to do when they open their mouths, that is not a crime. But if you live with peace, with truth, that is a problem. So justice is for action. Truth is for speech. Truth is, your speech has to be honest. And acts of kindness and peace is thought. Because if you follow justice, you do the right things and you say the right things, but in your heart you have animosity towards others, and therefore there's no peace, it's based on the fact that your thoughts are not the way they should be. You know, it says in the Torah you're not allowed to speak ill of others, lashon hara. What about thinking ill of others? There's no law that says that. But the Tanya, the classic Hasidic work, says it's worse than speaking lashon hara. Because sometimes someone says something wrong, speech is not an integral part of you the way thought is. The negative thought hurts you, pollutes your soul more than negative speech. Now usually negative speech is based on negative thought, so you have a double whammy, so it doesn't make it better. But if it's just negative speech, without thinking, someone just blurts out something negative about someone, it's wrong, of course, but it doesn't pollute your soul, it doesn't contaminate your soul, it doesn't compromise your soul as much as negative thought. There's a story, yes?
But negative speech can cause somebody else to then have negative ideas.
Yes, that's true. It could lead to murder. It could lead to terrible consequences. We're talking in terms of how it affects you. The speech doesn't affect you as much as thought. There's a story told about an author who wrote a book. I don't know if it's a true story or it's just an anecdote that they tell to illustrate the point, but there was someone who wrote a book about not speaking ill of others, lashon hara. And in order to get the book disseminated, he sent one of his students to many great rabbis to review the book and give reviews for the book. And if they give a good review, the book would sell. So he comes to a bunch of rabbis, and they're all very enthusiastic about the book. They couldn't find any fault with it, and they write enthusiastic endorsements, except for one rabbi. One rabbi asked, does the book talk about evil thoughts? And he said, no, it's about evil speech. He says, well, in that case, I'm not going to give an endorsement. I think he left out a major thing. When he comes back to the author, and he shows the author all the endorsements, the author was very happy, but then he saw that one rabbi that he sent him to for an endorsement didn't give it. He says, what's the reason that rabbi didn't give an endorsement? And he didn't want to say, he just like, yeah, well, he wasn't so enthusiastic. And the author was about to say something negative about that rabbi. And then he realized that he was going to be speaking Lashon Hara, and he controls himself and he stops saying it. And the man said that was the reason he didn't give the endorsement. Because you were prepared not to speak ill, but you were thinking ill. And that's why he didn't want to give the endorsement. In other words, people think, you know what, if you think ill of others and you restrain yourself and you don't talk ill, you might restrain yourself one time, but it's going to come out some other time, inevitably. Guaranteed? No. Maybe not inevitably, but most likely. Because if you can't get rid of the negative thought, the speech will come one way or another. So we have to work on our thoughts, that our thoughts are pure, that we don't carry animosity in our minds. In other words, you can say, I hate this person, but I'm not going to say it because it's Lashon Hara. No, you have to work that you shouldn't think those negative thoughts. It shouldn't occur to you to think them.
Aren't these things, I mean, how do you make the distinction between thoughts and speech when it's intention, thoughts, action, and speech should all be free of that, right? I mean, isn't that the garments of the soul?
Right, we have to make sure all our garments are clean.
Right.
The action, speech, and thought. So when it comes to justice focuses mostly on action. Justice doesn't, in society, justice doesn't tell you what to say and what to think. Truth demands that you speak in a certain way. And acts of kindness, or peace rather, peace requires that you think in a certain way, because if you hate someone in your heart, it's going to eventually lead to lack of peace between you and the other person. You have to think positive. So it covers all those three bases. If you're looking for a connection to baseball, the baseball season begins. The baseball season has all three bases. Thought, speech, and action. Everything that happens in the world has to teach us a lesson. Do you know when the baseball season begins? At the time of the year when we start reading double portions, double headers. Although this year, there's not going to be a double header this week, but many years there is one. Yeah.
Is there the way to deal with negative thoughts in my head?
Yeah, there is a way. It depends. If the thoughts are negative about another person, you have to learn how to judge the person favorably. To recognize, you know what the person did to me? First of all, maybe I deserved it. King David, when he was cursed by someone, said, I probably deserved it. God asked him to curse me. So it assuaged his anger. He was no longer angry at the person. He was able to get rid of that anger. Then you think, well, the person had a hard day, a difficult day. Maybe they behaved in a certain way because it wasn't his fault. It was. You find always looking for the positive in the other person, and then say, look, but the person may have a fault, but he has so many qualities. Why am I focusing on the faults? You have to keep on meditating that way, and then recognize that, you know what, my soul, I share my soul with his soul or her soul. We have something in common. Just like if your own child or your own parent or a very close friend would say something that you get angry about, you're able to swallow it because it's someone you love. So it's a whole process. It take years and years to cleanse your thoughts. But cleansing thoughts is really the key to speech as well. Some commentaries say that justice is mostly for the judge. Truth is mostly for the witnesses. The judge metes out justice. Not the people who come to court. It's the judge who has the power of meting out justice. But who has to be truthful? The people who give the evidence, the witnesses. But a good judge and honest witnesses won't help in solving problems if there's no peace. If the two litigants come to court, two people come to court with a feud, if they don't care about bringing the results of the case to a settlement where they can be at peace with each other, the justice will not work and the truth will not work. You need the justice. If the judge is corrupt, it's terrible. It's going to mess things up. If the witnesses are not truthful, witnesses or the litigants, of course, but if the litigants are not going to be prepared to accept the judgment of the court, if they don't come out of court hugging each other, then the justice will not be served. And I saw this in many times where people came to a rabbinical court and they committed themselves to following whatever the rabbinical court decided, and they still hated each other. That means that the whole process was messed up.
They were not followers of Aaron.
They were not followers of Aaron, right? What?
Wasn't divorce court, was it?
No, that's the one court that you don't want them to embrace afterwards.